Hello everyone and welcome back to History with Mr. Roberts. Now today we're doing one of my favourite topics in the history of the Second World War, Dunkirk. And it's an important part of our national story here in Britain. But the question this video is going to answer today is why on the 24th of May 1940 did Hitler issue a halt order to his armies that were surrounding the British and French at Dunkirk? Why did Hitler make this decision? What were the reasons behind it? We're also going to look at, was it true that Hitler wanted to sue for peace for Britain and that he was always offering them a golden bridge to evacuate their army rather than defeat it? So why did Hitler make these decisions? Let's find out. So on the 10th of May 1940, Hitler's army strikes west, invading the Netherlands, Belgium and France. Now, of course, the French forces believe that the invasion will likely come through maybe Belgium, but of course they have the Maginot Line against the German frontier, and that's where some French generals expect the invasion to occur. Now, of course, Army Group A in the German army, led by Rundstedt, is the main strike force. Now, they go through the Ardennes forest, which is a total shock to the Allies. Now, the Ardennes is deeply forested, very windy roads, and the British and French air forces are nowhere near the Ardennes. Now, they probably could have defeated the German invasion in those first vital hours because most of the armoured vehicles in the Ardennes from the German side were in a sheer traffic jam. But of course, as this is not done, the German forces perform a sickle cut manoeuvre and drive towards the French coast. Now let's look at some of the footage from the German side of the attack.
Unter uns zerstörte Brücken und hart umkämpfte Orte. Achtung! Das Ziel im Raum von Dünkirchen ist erreicht. Alles ist angriffsbereit. Die Bomben sausen in dichter Folge zur Erde nieder. Treffer sitzt neben Treffer.
Now, with the German advance, the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, together with their French and Polish allies, are now trapped in the Dunkirk pocket. Now, you can see the little boat icons here representing the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy is vast at this point in the war. They are starting to come across to rescue as many people as possible, together with all the little boats that leave Britain to come and rescue all the soldiers. Now, as the troops are trapped in that pocket, there are German planes flying over, dropping these leaflets. Now, the leaflets have a very key core message. Basically, the game is up, encouraging British and French and Polish troops to lay down their weapons. Now, the French translation is slightly different, and it kind of makes a point of saying that the French leaders have abandoned their troops, and that really they should give up. Now, it's at this point when almost everything seems lost that Hitler makes a very unwise decision, and he issues a halt order. Now, rather, he approves the halt order because the halt order has come from his generals, especially Rundstedt, who's in charge of Army Group A, the main strike force from the German army. Now, as they approach the River Aar in northern France, the forces halt. There's a lot of people, especially a lot of the tank commanders, the Panzer commanders, who are deeply shocked. Of course, a lot of these soldiers are obviously great to have a moment's rest, to be able to get some supplies in, and for the infantry to catch up with the Panzers. But it does leave a lot of the generals quite bemused. There's shock throughout the Wehrmacht, although the high command have made the decision. There's a lot of soldiers on the ground who can't quite understand why they are not moving in to finish off the French and British forces. Now, of course, behind the scenes, Hitler is meeting with his generals, and there's a few things that are troubling him. So Hitler's generals are worried about supply chain. They're worried about their supply of oil and petrol. They're also looking at maps, and they're also working out that they've moved very far ahead of their infantry. So the Panzers and the Luftwaffe are ahead of the infantry. And of course, they need the infantry to catch up. Hitler's also looking at the maps and realizing that the terrain around Dunkirk is very marshy. There's lots of rivers, there's lots of canals. It's not suitable for a massive armoured attack. Now, of course, Hitler's also worried about preserving as much of his military force as he can, ready for Case Red, which will be the southern invasion of the rest of France. Now, of course, one of the biggest reasons is Hitler's relationship with Hermann Goring. Now, Hermann Goring at the time has promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe can defeat the British and French forces on the beach. He basically tells Hitler that the Luftwaffe will be able to strike Calais, Boulogne, and Dunkirk. And this makes Hitler think, well, actually, I do not need to risk more soldiers and more armaments in finishing off the British and the French. So Hermann Goring manages to convince Hitler that he can use the Luftwaffe to finish the job. Now, of course, as you can see here for some of the clips, the Luftwaffe begin attacks on Dunkirk, but the reality is the RAF are very strong, and the RAF have been held back in the Battle of France to defend Britain and to defend the beaches around Dunkirk.
Abwurf! Sofort wird die Maschine wieder hochgezogen!
Now, of course, with that halt order, the British Merchant Navy and the little boats are able to evacuate over 338,000 troops from the beaches. So that's 215,000 British troops and around 123,000 French troops. Now, they're picked up from the beaches, they're picked up from the harbours, and they're able to escape across the channel. Now, of course, the German Luftwaffe are doing their best to impede the rescue. They're dropping bombs, they're strafing people on the beaches and those who are on the ships. But at this point, this halt order gives Britain and France the chance to get their troops back across the English Channel. By the time the Germans actually arrived at Dunkirk, once Hitler had realised his folly and lifted the halt order, many realised it was too late. Whilst they'd taken Dunkirk, hundreds of thousands of British, French, and Polish soldiers had managed to escape to Britain. Now, since then, lots of historians have debated the reasons as to why Hitler made this decision, and we've looked at a few already. But one of the biggest myths is that Hitler basically allowed Britain to escape because he wanted to sue for peace with Britain. A lot of historians say that Hitler admired the British Empire, wanted to offer Britain a golden bridge to evacuate its troops, who then might join in the future as allies of Germany against the Soviet Union. Now, there are other historians that say that Britain was going to give in anyway, and that Hitler believed that allowing the British army to escape was no big deal, because that once France collapsed, Britain would inevitably sue for peace. But in reality, there was no evidence to support any of these arguments. Hitler was looking at Hermann Goring and the Luftwaffe to destroy the British and French and Polish forces on the ground. There's no evidence whatsoever to suggest that Hitler wanted to have a peace agreement with Britain. Ideally, it'd be great to make a peace agreement with Britain because it would take Britain out of the war. But as you can see from the sheer devastation in Dunkirk, Hitler was not going soft on British forces. Now, of course, once the British evacuated, they left behind a lot of equipment. 164,000 tons of petrol, 63,000 vehicles, 20,000 motorcycles, 415,000 tons of supplies, and 76,000 tons of ammunition. Now, on paper, it was a total disaster for Britain and France, but the sheer ability to evacuate over 300,000 troops meant that Britain especially could still live to fight another day. Okay, so hopefully this video has answered that core question we had at the very beginning of the video. Why did Hitler issue a halt order on the 24th of May 1940, therefore giving the French and the British time to escape from their pocket in Dunkirk? Now, there were lots of different reasons, so let's just summarize. Some of them were big and some of them were very, very small. Now, we have to remember that the order was approved by Hitler, but the request came from his generals. This was not Hitler's brainwave. His generals were really, really nervous about supply chain. We have to remember they'd fought their way through Holland and Belgium and into northern France. They'd lost an awful lot of armour, their tanks needed repair, and they were worried about supply chain. They were worried about oil supplies, petrol supplies being able to get through to the front line. The generals were also concerned that the infantry were quite far behind the tanks. The whole point of Blitzkrieg, as it was evolving during the war, was that fighter planes and tanks would move ahead, but the infantry would be close behind, and at Dunkirk that was not the case. Another reason is the terrain. The generals, as well as Hitler, were nervous about the terrain around Dunkirk. It's very marshy, lots of rivers, lots of canals, not really appropriate for a massive armoured manoeuvre into the port. Now, another reason is that Hitler was very, very worried about Case Red. Now, his generals as well were kind of looking at the rest of France and thinking that once the British were destroyed at Dunkirk, they would still need to take over the rest of France. Now, of course, the Germans at this point did not realise how quickly France would collapse. So, of course, they wanted to strengthen their army and maintain as much of it as they could before they swung back south. Now, one of the biggest myths about Dunkirk is the idea that Hitler admired the British. He liked the British Empire. He wanted to sue for peace with Britain against a possible war with the Soviet Union later in the 1940s. It is safe to say this is a myth. There is no evidence whatsoever that Hitler in any way wanted to save the British army or give them a golden bridge, if you like, back to Britain. We have to remember that at this point, Hermann Göring, who was the Reich Marshal for the Luftwaffe, he had promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe would finish off Calais, Boulogne and Dunkirk and therefore destroy British and French forces on the beach. Now, in Hitler's mind, that's a lot less risky. He's going to lose a lot less troops, a lot less armour if he can just use planes to strafe and bomb from the sky. So, of course, this is part of our national story. By Hitler making this one decision, 338,000 British and French troops were able to escape Dunkirk and get back to Britain to continue the fight. Now, only a couple of days later, Churchill gives his famous speech in Parliament where he rallies the nation to keep on fighting against Hitler. Now, a lot of people look back and say, is this an example of one of the reasons why Hitler lost the war? Of course, there are lots of reasons: resources, foreign capital, or the lack of. But it is right to say that by allowing the British and the French to escape, Hitler still made the error of having a two-front war. He knew that without defeating Britain, if he was to move to the east, he would be fighting on two fronts. So it is safe to assume that Dunkirk played a pivotal role in knocking Hitler out of the war. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed the video. Please subscribe, share, and I'll see you next time.